Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome to Talking Tudors episode 166. I'm your host Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today for this special anniversary episode of Talking Tudors. 4 years ago today, I published the first ever episode of the podcast. Since then, I've recorded, edited, and published 166 free episodes and interviewed so many exceptional people. This podcast is a huge part of my life, and I thank you for joining me on this amazing journey. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's podcast, Tudor Places Magazine. Tudor Places Magazine explores the sites, buildings and interiors of the Tudor world and their stories past and present. From castles, palaces, abbeys, cathedrals, manor houses and churches, to guild halls, almshouses, schools, shops and military forts, Tudor Places Magazine looks at what these buildings were like, where they were, how they were built, the people who built them and what we can still see of them now. The magazine shines a light on places from the Tudor world as they were then, and all of the discoveries and up-to-date knowledge about those places today. Each issue has ideas and suggested itineraries for visiting places with Tudor connections and insights about recent discoveries, along with interviews and book listings too. Readers can subscribe to print and digital editions of the magazine. Print copies can be posted worldwide. To find out more about this fantastic magazine and to subscribe, go to www.tudorplaces.com. It's been a very exciting week indeed. In case you missed the announcement on the last episode, my new book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, is now available for pre-order. I worked on this book for almost 3 years, but it's really the culmination of the last 13 years of study and research into the life and times of Anne Boleyn. I would be incredibly honoured if you'd consider pre-ordering a copy. Pre-publication sales are incredibly important to authors, which is why it would mean so much to me. The Final Year of Anne Boleyn will be published in the UK on November 30 and in the US in early 2023. You can pre-order your copy today from a number of online retailers, including the Book Depository, which offers free worldwide shipping. I'd also like to thank everyone who's chosen to support my podcast on Patreon, and a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. This really does make a difference. Perhaps to celebrate this anniversary, you could leave me a review or share the podcast on social media. Why not make this the day that you join the Talking Tudors Patreon family? This would mean so much to me. If you're quick, you can take advantage of a special offer that I'm currently running. Check out all the details at patreon.com/talkingtudors. Another way you can support the podcast is by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I'd love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to discuss our enduring fascination with the Tudors is Dr. Owen Emmerson. Dr. Emmerson is a social and cultural historian currently working as castle historian and assistant curator at the stunning Hever Castle in Kent, Anne Boleyn's childhood home. He completed his doctoral research at the University of Sussex. Owen's first book, co-authored with historian Claire Ridgway, is entitled The Boleyns of Hever Castle. His second book, co-authored with historian Kate McCaffrey, is entitled Becoming Anne: Connections, Culture, Court. Our conversation's coming up straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. Owen, welcome back to Talking Tudors. I keep luring you back to my podcast. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. What an honour to be here for your anniversary episode. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it is a very exciting episode. Today is the fourth anniversary of Talking Tudors. I can actually hardly believe it that it's been 4 years. I still remember when the idea popped into my head, and I thought, oh, that sounds good. I wonder if anyone will actually listen. I'll just give it a go. And here we are 4 years later. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I know that most people, I think, especially my listeners, because I've had you on the show so many times, know who you are and what you do. But do you mind just giving everyone a short introduction about you?
Yes, of course. Well, my name is Dr Owen Emmerson. I'm a social and cultural historian. I completed my doctoral research at the University of Sussex. I'm the co-author of two books, The Boleyns of Hever Castle with historian Claire Ridgway, and Becoming Anne, Connections Culture Court with historian and assistant curator Kate McCaffrey. I've been in a few documentaries, including The Boleyns: A Scandalous Family with the BBC, and I'm really fortunate to work at Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's childhood home, as the castle historian and assistant curator.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think if I remember correctly, your BBC documentary is out in the US soon. Is that right, Owen?
It is, yes. I believe it's on the 8th of August that it's premiering on PBS. So very exciting times ahead. I loved working on that one. It was lots of fun.
Now, because it is the anniversary of Talking Tudors, I thought what we could do is chat a little bit about why there's this continued fascination with the Tudor period. And it is, of course, a worldwide phenomena, isn't it? Like, it's not just restricted to the UK or anything like that. It is just all over the world. There are fans of Tudor history, and I have been asking some other lovely Tudor historian buddies to share with me why they think this is the case. And now, Owen, I want to ask you. I've got lots of questions that I want to ask you. But before we jump straight in, can you tell us a little bit about what sparked your interest in the Tudors?
I can, yes. So it might be a surprise, but my first memories as a child relate to the Tudor era, and very specifically my mum showing me the glorious film Anne of the Thousand Days when I was roughly 4 years old. Something about that film completely captured my imagination at that very young age. And it soon became sort of an obsession, I would say. And I remember all of my birthday trips either being to Hever Castle, where about a third of that film was shot, or the Tower of London. Really, Hever sort of became a family place almost, a place to go to the theatre, have picnics, and very much became quite quickly the place I wanted to work one day. But more broadly, sort of every Christmas present, birthday present was Tudor related, books, videos, prints of portraits. And actually, I became very quickly fascinated by different interpretations of the Tudor story, and more specifically, how arguments were formed. I became really a historiography geek, I guess, at an early age. And I actually think that meant that I didn't do particularly well at GCSE and A-level history, really because of sort of the prescriptive format of those approaches. I wasn't very good at regurgitating a set narrative, and it didn't really interest me, particularly when I didn't agree with it, or if I was aware that there was sort of a counter narrative or other arguments to consider. So actually, I didn't do well academically with history until I got to university, which I was able to access with the help of a really extraordinary woman and a much missed woman, Anna Spender, who is then the curator of Hever Castle. And I didn't have the grades to get into uni, but she allowed me to come to Hever for an afternoon, where she gave me some really, really sage advice about how to prepare for an entrance essay. And I owe a huge amount to her. She absolutely adored Hever. She did a huge amount to develop that place, and so much of her remains there. And I was sort of a very, very much a beneficiary of her generosity. So yeah, that's sort of how my interest in the Tudor era began, how it developed, and how it's sort of taken me here.
Yes, I love that story. And I imagine that there's lots of people listening that are grateful that you've actually shared that, because perhaps they didn't do too well at school, or maybe they've recently graduated and they were thinking they wanted to do history, but they didn't enjoy it that much in high school, or whatnot. So I think that's really quite inspirational. And funnily enough, I'm quite the same. I did modern history in high school. Do not ask me why. I have no idea why that choice came up. But anyway, and then I didn't actually study history degrees at university, but still I'm here and making a career of what I love. So I think it's really great to share that with people. And I've heard it from others before, other historians, academics even, that have said that high school was not good for them. They weren't academic.
No.
And then this love was kind of ignited a little bit later. So it's never too late, people listening. If you want to follow your love of Tudor history, it is really, really never too late.
It really, really isn't too late. And there are so many different routes into history. You don't just have to go down an academic one. They're all valid. And yeah, I would just encourage people not to see where they've got to sort of academically as their constraint, or as a constraint, because there are many, many ways to get into history, to love it, to work in it. So yes, think outside the box and just go for it.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. So let's jump into this question. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts about this. So why do you think, Owen, that readers and viewers are absolutely insatiable when it comes to the Tudors?
Such a good question. And I think there's an obvious drama of this dynasty's history, and the fact that kind of if it was fictionalized, you may well question if the plot was pushing credulity. However, because of the wildness of this story, it is easily digestible. Every age group and every level of education. The Tudors, especially in the UK, have long been a staple of primary education, popular history books, and of television and film screens. And I think much to the dismay of other equally fascinating eras, the Tudors really do monopolise the popular consciousness. And I do think it's easy to understand why. I mean, this is a dynasty founded on a battlefield in the wake of the murder of two young princes. There is the precariousness of this family trying to secure an heir, which sort of threads through the age, beginning with the much longed for heir, Arthur, Prince of Wales, suddenly dying, and the spare Henry picking up that baton. And then, of course, we have the absolute preposterousness of that king having 6 wives, of killing 2 of them, struggling to secure his throne with a male heir. There's all the bombast of his glory hunting and financially ruinous wars with France, the glittering gold of empty promises with summits and treaties. And there's the cataclysmic break with Rome and the destruction of the monasteries. We have self-made men raised high, very high, and then cut down. We have princesses and daughters delegitimized, but kept in the line of succession, leaving them perilously positioned. We got a boy king radicalized by his uncle and protector. Under his rule, we have Protestant Reformation, and that boy king then goes on to kill both of his uncles with a frankly terrifying coldness. We have Crisis Year, when Edward tries to jettison his sisters from the throne in favour of his equally radical cousin Jane, only for Queen Mary to triumph and to enact a radical counter-reformation. We have rebellion, bloodshed, the imprisonment of the rival sister, the Marian persecutions, an alliance with Spain, and all the disappointments that Mary encountered with Philippa's Spain. And then, of course, we have the myth and spectacle of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, and all of the smoke and mirrors at play with her mythic reign. We have the active denigration of Queen Mary during this time, and conversely, the rehabilitation of Mary's nemesis, the great whore, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. But actually, I think our interest is bigger than the ridiculousness of that narrative. It's the first period in history where we can really get a good understanding of what these key characters actually looked like, for example, with the development of far more lifelike portraiture. We have an absolute dearth of documentation: letters, papers, finances, inventories, trial documents, diaries, wills, dispatches, which take us to the very heart of social and political life. And we can hear the music that these individuals played and listened to. We can cook and taste their food. We can walk in the rooms they occupied in astonishing surviving places like Hampton Court, the Tower, Hever Castle. And, even technology has allowed us to raise sunken ships of this era and to study the minutiae of everyday life aboard these vessels via the artifacts we've uncovered. And as you once brilliantly recognized, it's only time that separates us from these amazing actors. And I actually think that nostalgia plays a massive part here. There's something really primal, I think, about the feelings we get from revisiting old, well-trodden stories, almost as our ancestors did when sitting around the hearth and telling stories. Very few of us have a hearth anymore. We do have one at Hever, which I love lighting, but we do now have Netflix and widescreen TVs and Kindles. And actually, it's of no surprise to me at all that the story of the Tudors and their reign is a story that people return to again and again. And I think it's a far from uncomplicated habit of ours. The uses of nostalgia can be very, very problematic at times. But the Tudors really have become sort of a staple of a national and international identity. You mentioned that this is not just about the UK and England. This is an international phenomenon. So we have this extraordinary, almost unbelievable story, which has become a part of our national identity. But then we also have this burgeoning field of scholarship, which is aiming to illuminate, expand on, and often challenge this grand narrative that everyone now almost instinctively knows. And I find this really exciting, very challenging at times, and often wonderfully explosive. There is a real tension when challenging this grand narrative, and I personally love it. So it is thanks to people like you who allow people to access new ideas on such a regular basis. This is the wonder of what you do. And, it's wonderful to be talking about this on your podcast, because this is how a lot of people access new ideas about this period. So thank you.
Thank you. That was an absolutely exceptional response. I was taking notes and then I just stopped because I just wanted to take it all in and enjoy it. And you have brought up a lot of the things that some of those historians I mentioned have also spoken about in their responses. In particular, one that I saw come up quite a bit was what you mentioned about the fact that this is the first real period in which we can get a sense of what these people looked like. We can make a real emotional connection with them. And we, of course, have people like Hans Holbein to thank and other wonderful artists of the period. But if we think of the, previous centuries, we're not able to make that connection as we're desperate to know what people looked like, but we can't kind of connect with them because there's not enough of that visual evidence left. So I think that is a really amazing point. And all the summary of the drama of the period, Owen, I was just shaking my head. I can't believe, even being so familiar with the story, what an extraordinary story it is. And as you say, if for someone that came from another planet would probably imagine we're making the whole thing up, because how can all that be true? But it is true, which is, extraordinary. And I think they're also perfectly positioned, aren't they, the Tudors, the 16th century. I think it's, far back enough for it to be fascinating and intriguing and quite different, but not so far back that we can't relate and form a connection and see ourselves in them. That's the truth, isn't
absolutely.
it? When we look at these people, I get a sense of, oh yes, okay, I can recognize aspects of my own life and my own self in many of these people, which I think allows us to form those powerful bonds that just keep us coming back for more.
Totally.
So it's extraordinary. And another question that I wanted to ask you, Owen, I am an absolute lover of mysteries. I've loved them since I was a little child. And I had the great pleasure of being a child during the 80s. And apart from the fantastic music and great hairdos, there were so many shows about mysteries. There was, I think, Unsolved Mysteries, and listeners can write in and tell me about some other ones. Great Mysteries of the World. I think there was quite a lot of them that explored all these amazing mysteries. So what are your favorite mysteries from this period?
God, there's so many,
I
aren't
know.
there? My goodness. And actually, I think this is one of the big reasons that we all love the Tudors, actually. There are so many loose ends for us to attempt to tie up. And they're often really slippery, impervious to our best attempts. And it's a really messy landscape for us to try and negotiate. And we often get lost. So there's something really exciting about the challenge, isn't there, of trying to unpick and sort of darn up reason and theory to try and, crack these amazing mysteries. And I think one of the obvious answers would be who killed the princes in the tower. It's one of those questions that never really, for me, gets satisfactorily answered. And some of the theories are utterly bonkers. But that's what makes it exciting,
That's
isn't
the
it?
beauty
The
of it,
fact
isn't
that
it?
yeah, totally. I mean, one of my pet peeves actually is this modern, well, it's not particularly modern, but it's certainly not a contemporary idea that Margaret Beaufort killed the princes in the tower. That I don't know why that grinds my gears so much, but yes, that's definitely like one of my favourite sort of mysteries. One of the mysteries I would personally really like to get to the bottom of is what happened to Amy Robsart. Now, having spoken to many, many women who wear period accurate reproduction headdresses, the notion that her headgear remained on her head after falling down a staircase is a rather fanciful one, I think. So what did happen to her? I would love to get to the bottom of that one. I really would. Something doesn't add up. And again, there have been many, many wonderful theories, but I just want to know what the answer is. It's just tantalizing, isn't it? But a key one for me, it might not seem like the biggest mystery in the world to listeners, but Anne Boleyn's birth date is one of the biggest mysteries in my life. It's sort of like plagued me from day one. There have been many, many valiant attempts to crack it, but I would love to have more certainty. And I had a really interesting debate with the magnificent historians Claire Ridgway and Gareth Russell about this recently. And I would urge you all to look out for Gareth's forthcoming arguments for not a 1501 or a 1507 date, but a 1504/5 date in the coming months. I'm not going to tell you what the arguments are because they are Gareth's arguments, but it got me thinking again. I'd finally settled on a date and it got me thinking again. And I love that this is very much a live debate still. And it really matters. It really matters how old Anne was when she died, because if she was younger than historians had previously believed, then the likelihood of her being killed solely because of her ability to get pregnant in the future shifts all of a sudden. There's something at stake with this particular mystery. So that's one of my favourites. I guess this is a mystery, but I'd love to find out what happened to Anne Boleyn's replies to his so-called love letters. What did they say? We can only glean really snippets of information via how Henry himself had interpreted Anne's words and then responded to them. So they're not really a reflection of what she actually said. They are a reflection of his understanding of what she said, or his interpretation, or maybe even what he wanted to hear. And I think her letters could tell us so much about their so-called courtship. And, I would love to know what happened to them too. Were they stolen as well? Are they in the Vatican's secret archive and no one's telling us about them? Or were they just burnt in a fury and frenzy? That's a massive biggie for me. I'd love to know more about Thomas Cromwell's youth. That's a big mystery. His time in Italy in particular. And also a biggie for me is what happened just before Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry was annulled. What were the conversations that happened in the Tower? What was offered to Anne? Was there a bargaining chip at play? There is so much mystery around that particular event, and I just want to know what happened. So yes, they are my biggies. And there are so many more, but they are the ones that sort of fascinate me.
They're all amazing mysteries. And, as you know, Owen, the Anne Boleyn ones drive me absolutely crazy as well and have fueled much of the work that I do. And I saw that lively debate between yourself and Claire and Gareth. It was so entertaining. I'm open to definitely to hear Gareth's ideas. And I'm quite open to a little bit of a later date, as we've discussed. Not quite so late as some people think, but I'm happy to keep an open mind. I think that's what we need to do in these situations, don't we?
Definitely.
And I have a lot of questions about portraits, especially portraits of Anne. I am absolutely convinced that Holbein would have painted her. Like I'm so convinced I would put a lot of money on this. So what happened to it? Why don't we have a record of even him painting it? Where has it gone? Has someone got it hidden somewhere? Did they start using canvas at that point and it's rolled up somewhere in a cupboard? Like, who knows? There could be so many things that happened to that. But it's wonderful just thinking about it, isn't it?
Oh my God, yeah. I spend a lot of the time that I am not talking, which is quite a lot of time, to be honest, thinking about these things and tying myself in knots and getting thoroughly frustrated. So yes, I'm glad I've got good company in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think? There are so many what if moments in this, sliding door moments where things could have just gone slightly different and completely changed the whole trajectory of the story. And of course, then history. So what are your kind of favorite or biggest what if moments? And how do you think, just for fun, that they would have changed the course of history?
Oh, I love these kind of questions. I really do. And there are a number that sort of like I often think about, actually most often when I'm up in the long gallery at Hever, because so many of the key players in this story are represented with contemporary portraits up there. And quite often, for example, I will pass our portrait of Prince Arthur and think, what if you hadn't died? What if you hadn't died? What would the story look like then? What would an Arthurian reign have looked like? Would Catherine and Arthur have been more successful in providing an heir? That's a real biggie for me. And particularly, you try to think, well, when would a reformation have occurred in England without the Great Matter? I kind of think there would have been one. I'm almost certain there would have been one. But when would it have been? That's a huge one for me. Is that one that you think about?
Absolutely. That's, I remember standing in Worcester Cathedral, right? Oh, and that's where Arthur's buried. Yes. And standing there and just thinking, oh my gosh, what would have happened had he been healthy, survived, not gotten ill? Would he have, as you said, remained with Catherine? What would Henry have done? Would he have entered the church? Good old Henry VIII. That wouldn't have been Henry VIII, Henry Tudor. All those things. And then you just think of the ripple effect of the events that aren't going to happen if Henry's not on the throne. Some of them may have come about anyway, like you say, the Reformation. And someone asked me that recently, do I think the Reformation would have happened without kind of Henry and Anne's whole situation? And it's a really interesting question to ponder, isn't it? Because I think those ideas would have filtered through anyway at some point. Yes. Perhaps it would have been a little bit later, who knows? But it's such an interesting question to think about.
It massively is. And I often think, another one, what if Catherine of Aragon had a surviving son? And I often think this in relation to Anne. What would Anne's life have been like? And one of the big questions that comes out of that, and I don't buy into this narrative that Anne grew up wanting to be queen. I do not believe that for a second. I think she was put in a situation and she did what Boleyns did best in finding the best possible outcome for themselves in the situation they found themselves in. But, what would she have just been a mistress of many manners and had a relatively quiet life? I don't think so. I think she'd have definitely been a courtier. She'd have married someone fairly important, I think, and, would have had quite an interesting court career, I should imagine. That's one of the biggies for me. What would these women's lives have looked like had they not been thrust into each other's paths and pitted against each other? One of the big ones for me is about Henry, actually. And what if he'd just recognised that his sister, Margaret, had a son and placed him in the line of succession? Would this concession on his part have saved this enormous turmoil that Henry's heirs then had to negotiate? That's one that I often think about. And, what if Edward had lived longer and provided heirs? Would Mary and Elizabeth have been queens consort of other countries? You can't imagine them in that more subservient role, can you? Like, they were such amazing queens regnant. So another biggie for me, because I love 1553. What if Edward had actually ratified his device for the succession with Parliament? What if it had been a foolproof challenge to Henry's will, an act of succession? What would 1553 have looked like then? I think it still would have been very, very messy indeed. I don't think Mary would have
No.
would have gone quietly, shall we say? So it might well have led to full out sort of civil war. That's something that fascinates me. I still don't think, even with the support of Parliament, that James' reign would have been a long one. Absolutely fascinating. And then, of course, sort of the last one I'm going to mention here. What if Elizabeth had married? What if she'd had children? How long would the Tudor dynasty have actually lasted for? One of their great failures as a dynasty was securing the succession. But what if it hadn't have been so messy? What if Elizabeth had chosen to marry? Maybe if she'd married Anjou, what would we look like now? I think it's a really fascinating one.
It is absolutely so fascinating. What if the Spanish Armada had succeeded? What if they'd invaded?
Yes.
There's just no end to it, really, is there? You can just keep going. And it's I think, a telltale sign of what a rich period of history this is, that we have so many, paths that we can explore, even just like this for a bit of fun. But it's so fascinating. And we talked a little bit before about portraits. Oh, and I know you love portraits as much as I do. We often share the ones we love. So what is one or two or a few of your favorite portraits from the 16th century?
So I should caveat this with, art history is not my area of expertise, but early modern portraiture is a particular passion of mine. I actually collect portrait miniatures. I love portrait miniatures for some reason. I think they're amazing. But I am also very privileged to work with and assist in the curation and care of some of the finest Tudor portraits in a private collection, I believe, at Hever Castle. And I am learning a huge amount about how these portraits were created, how they have changed over time, how they can be restored. And that's one of the most exciting aspects of my job, actually. I love every bit of it. And getting to work with these really extraordinary portraits is joy. So, having said all that, we do have a massive collection of Tudor portraiture, and there is a huge amount more out there in the world. So you're really challenging me here. And it's definitely going to be a plural answer. I think one of my all-time favourites has to be the Hever Rose portrait of Anne Boleyn. There is so much mystery around that portrait, and I've had the wonderful pleasure of working with my friend Lee Porritt recently, trying to uncover some of the provenance of it. Until recently, we had no idea when it had arrived at Hever, but we have sort of almost confirmed now that it likely came from Assington Hall in Suffolk. It was part of the collection of the Gurdon family, who were related to the Boleyn. Two of the Gurdon daughters lived and died at Blickling Hall, of course, the Boleyn's family seat. So we are getting closer, I think, to having a better understanding of how, why, and when the many corridor portraits of Anne Boleyn were created. Now, when this portrait was exhibited in 2007 at the Lost Faces exhibition, it was given a circa date of 1550, which I think is an unlikely creation date, purely because Edward is during Edward's reign. So, was the circa, we're now questioning, placed on it because of the allowance either side of that central date that it necessarily allows? So, roughly 15 years either side, which puts us potentially in the early reign of Elizabeth, or potentially it places us in the latter years of her mother's reign, of course, the subject of the portrait, Anne's reign. And it might surprise you to know, listeners, because you almost certainly heard the phrase, there are no contemporary portraits of Anne Boleyn, that very, very few of the portraits that survive with Anne's name on it have ever been scientifically tested. They might have been stylistically dated, but I can only think really of 3 portraits that have had any paint analysis done on them, or have indeed had their panels dated by dendrochronology. So I'm really hoping that in the coming years, we can sort of collectively put a project together which finally creates a chronology of when these portraits were painted, because it's important, I think. I think it matters. And if we could get a timeline together, we could really get a better understanding of what Anne Boleyn actually looked like. I do think there was far more to Anne Boleyn's story than her looks. But, all of us would love to get a glimpse of Anne. It's one of the great tragedies that we aren't really able to get a glimpse of her. So, I'm really hopeful that we are hopefully going to get a better timeline together of when these portraits were created. There are many of them, and who knows, one of them may turn out to be a contemporary portrait after all. I've already mentioned one of my other favourite portraits. It's the small easel portrait of Arthur, Prince of Wales, again held at Hever. This is an absolute treasure. It's older than any portrait held in the National Portrait Gallery, and it's the only known portrait to date to Arthur's lifetime. It is held incredibly securely at Hever, but it is really hard to sort of overstate its significance. It was likely created as a betrothal portrait for Catherine of Aragon. It's an incredibly intimate little portrait, and it passed to King Henry VIII and can be found in his inventories. And it was in the possession of no less than 11 monarchs thereafter. It's an extraordinary little object, and it's an honour to see it on an almost daily basis. And it's quite often the first thing that I purposefully look at in the morning to ensure it's there. And it's definitely the last thing I look for at night as well. I love it. I had the absolute honour of holding it recently, and it just sent shivers down my spine, to be honest, that it was likely held by Arthur.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that with those, the miniatures and those smaller cabinet style portraits that started coming out, that the person's holding them up close to view them, especially the miniatures, which were often worn on the body, on the skin, or kept in the bedchamber. Elizabeth had so many in her bedchamber that she'd only kind of bring out for very special guests. But it's incredible picturing it either in their palm or in their hand, and how close they must have gotten to look at the details, perhaps with a magnifying glass. Who knows? It's just extraordinary to think that now you're looking at that portrait that all these other incredible people have also looked at.
They're so intimate, aren't they? You've really tapped into why I love portrait miniatures, because of their intimacy. And actually, this portrait of Arthur, because of its size, it is very small. It's called an easel portrait because it is tiny. It was most likely commissioned by Henry VII. So he quite likely held it. I should imagine Elizabeth of York held it, and certainly Arthur did. And Catherine of Aragon, it was one of her beloved possessions. And then Henry VIII obviously held it at some point. It was in his collection. So, it just kind of baffles. Not only have they looked on this thing, but they've actually held it, and now I'm holding it. It honestly, it's such an honour. It really is, and I would desperately encourage people, if they can, to come and see it, and just take a bit of time to stand there and really think. What eyes have been on this thing. It's quite a remarkable experience. Lastly, one of my other favourite portraits is a recently restored portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, and it's the full-length portrait of Queen Catherine Parr, which is attributed to Master John. I love this portrait. I've always loved it. I mean, when I was a kid, it was still called Lady Jane Grey, and I remember going to the National Portrait Gallery especially to see it, because I had a real affinity with Jane in my youth. And of course, it's subsequently been revealed not to be Jane Grey at all. It's Catherine Parr. But I remember as a child just staring at the detail in the clothing. And because it's full size, it's quite unusual in comparison to the remaining portraits of the other queens. Although we do know that full-length portraits, for example, of Anne Boleyn once existed. But this seems very unusual. actually, for us in comparison with the other surviving portraits. It's almost like she can just sort of step out. She's all there, everything's there. And I just am dazzled by the extravagance of her attire, the jewels. You are under no illusion that this is a queen. And if I could take one portrait home, I think it would have to be that. I utterly adore it. It's gorgeous.
It is a fabulous portrait, and I plan to show some images of all these portraits that you've mentioned on social media so that everyone can have a look at just how magnificent they are. It's just, and I like that you've got the contrast between the obviously very intimate ones and then this very quite large portrait of Catherine Parr, which is an extraordinarily beautiful portrait. As you say,
Yes.
Completely dazzling, even after all these centuries. So you can just imagine what it must have been like when it was fresh, freshly painted. Yeah. It must have just been mind-boggling. So changing the subject slightly, I want to know what you think are some of the greatest innovations of the Tudor period.
Oh, this is such a good question. And there are so many. We could talk about chimneys, we could talk about tennis, theatre, pamphlets and the press. We could talk about knitting machines if you wanted to. Upholstery, platform shoes. The sort of list is endless, really. But for me, one of the greatest innovations, I think, and I'm thinking with my historian's hat on here, has to be the retention of the documentation of the era, of not only state papers, but personal papers. Just, for example, from my perspective, studying the 700 years of the history of Hever Castle, you can see a noticeable difference in the 16th century of the documentation that was amassed compared to the eras that came before. And this richness, this thickness of evidence really allows us to get at policy, but get behind politics too. And it allows us to get at the people who are alive and who are governing and who are being governed. And I actually think that Thomas Cromwell has a lot to do with this sort of fastidious retention of this, this much documentation. For example, he certainly ensured that from 1538 we have parish records for the first time, compulsory ones. Yeah. Totally. And these are enormously helpful windows into the everyday and the extraordinary. So for me, this is one of the greatest innovations of the age, the thickness of the detail. We really can sort of open windows into people's souls, to steal a lovely phrase from the time. And that's everything. To me as a historian, I really want to get not just at the policy, but the people and ordinary people too. I'm thinking here of Professor Susanna Lipscomb's wonderful work, Ordinary Women in France. You can't do that with other eras that come before. You really can't, not to the degree that you can in the early modern period. So yeah, that's my take on what the greatest innovation of the era was.
I'm just so fascinated by those more quiet personal moments as well. And as you say, they are very difficult to get to, of course, because they are quiet and personal moments. However, they reveal so much and they're so telling. So I think we, as challenging as it is, we need to keep pursuing that, as well as the big moments and the big, politics going on. But the parish records, it's so funny that you mentioned that, because yes, 1538, as you said, but it took a little while to kind of come into action, which sadly has left us missing a lot of information for people such as Mary Boleyn, that I have driven myself completely bonkers trying to find, a funeral date for her or a burial date.
We're all looking for a grave, aren't we? My God.
Yes,
so
I know.
Frustrating.
I feel that there's something out there to be found. So, let's persevere. And of course, Anne's birth. Had they been keeping those records from earlier, we wouldn't be having that discussion about when Anne was born or when George was born or when Mary was born. So it's just interesting that it came in, but just a little bit too late for what we are desperate to know.
Just a little bit too late, isn't it? So frustrating.
Oh, and you know what? It's time to spill the beans. We're just going to go for it here. I need you to spill the beans. And I know some of your less favorite Tudors, but I think you have to share. Spill the beans on the Tudors you love to hate.
It's tea time, isn't it? It's really tea time.
It's tea time.
firstly, before we serve up tea, I would like to put a disclaimer out there that there are many people that I love studying and many that I dislike intensely, but I don't think it should matter on a personal level to us. As historians, if people don't agree with us, if people don't share our sentiments, that's fine. Like, there seems to be an odd trait from time to time where people take criticism of their favourite historical figures as a personal insult. And I think it really is important to note that these people they're not our friends. They aren't our personality either. We shouldn't make them our personality. And I do think we should be respectful to a degree of people's right to detest historical people we admire. So basically, I'm saying don't come at me after the tea. So one of my all-time favourite people to hate has to be Thomas Howard.
Oh, yes. So I think you've got a lot of people supporting you on that one.
I find him to be a truly repugnant individual. It's very difficult to find any of his peers that respected him, or his family, or his wife. There really is nothing to like about him. It's quite an astonishing legacy, actually. And I kind of love to hate him, if you know what I mean. I'd kind of miss him if he wasn't there, because I hate him so much. So yes, he has to be up there. This will be of no surprise to you, Natalie. Edward, the boy king, Edward VI, I find chilling, and that's actually one of the things I should have said in the alternate histories. I actually think him dying was sounds terrible to say. I'm glad a child died. Sounds really terrible, actually.
This has deteriorated quickly, hasn't it?
I know. What am I doing? But I actually think his reign as an adult could have been cataclysmic, certainly for Catholics. I think, I'm really trying to think of the bigger picture here. I think it could have been horrific, actually. I think he showed terrifying traits throughout his short reign. I actually had the privilege of seeing a small little book that Edward had essentially been practicing French in, and it's all addressed to the Lord Protector. Absolutely fascinating little book. I'd never even heard of it before. I'd never seen it before, and got the opportunity to see it. And at Cambridge, essentially, what the Lord Protector was doing was asking Edward to, in his French lessons, focus on idolatry in the Bible. And oh my goodness, it's absolutely the work of a zealot. It's terrifying. I really found it quite terrifying. I think he was actually almost groomed into that extremist position by Seymour, the Lord Protector. But then, what he goes on to do, and probably the first king to write a diary, and the chilling way that he writes about Somerset's execution keeps me up at night, really. I find it terrifying. I really, really do. It's so cold. It's so detached. And yes, I really think that alternate history would have looked quite horrific indeed. But I have to say, Edward put aside, that one of my least favourite characters of the age is Thomas Seymour, Lord Protector's brother. He utterly fascinates me. He frightens me, and often appalls me too. I actually have a feeling that he is one of those men who we probably, on a surface level, would have liked. I think he could easily charm. He was probably very good company. And I think his ability to use wit and charm enabled him to do truly appalling things, such as his wholly inappropriate actions and advances towards his stepdaughter, the then 13-year-old Lady Elizabeth, future Queen Elizabeth I. Now, there's often this argument proffered that girls at that age could be married at 13. Actually, consummation was not at all desired at 13. And certainly, sex out of wedlock at 13 was not at all desired. It's a really daft argument to put up, because of course Seymour was married to the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr at the time. So nothing good at all could ever have come of his wholly inappropriate behaviour. And today, of course, we would absolutely recognise it as child abuse. We shouldn't recognise it then, per se, as child abuse. That would be looking through modern eyes, but it was frowned upon at the time. Yeah. It was not desired behaviour, and he has to be up there. Mainly, I think, because he probably would have been able to groom us all into not seeing what he was doing. And I think that is even more frightening than some of the more overtly horrific behaviour. I think that's even more terrifying.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, that even in the case of Thomas Seymour, if we set aside our modern lens for a moment and just think about what his contemporaries would have thought of his behavior, it was still completely and utterly inappropriate. So I think, as you say, when people say, oh, but they got married, you're so right to point out that even in those cases where sometimes they were married quite early at 14, they did not cohabit, usually not until 16 or later, and they certainly would not have been recommending any sort of sexual activity prior to at least 16 or older even. You know, so setting aside our kind of disgust for that, just, you know, his contemporaries would have thought the same. But I think, Owen, you're safe. You're safe for now with Thomas Howard. I don't see anybody starting a Thomas Howard society.
Hopefully not.
You know, we've got a Henry VII society, we've got an Anne Boleyn society, we've got a Richard III society. I don't think we're going to see a Thomas Howard society. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps someone out there is planning one. So I think you're pretty safe there. Thomas Seymour, I'm not sure, because as you say, he's managed to charm people back then. He's managed to charm people now. So beware. There may be some Twitter messages on their way to you. I think you're pretty safe with Edward as well. I don't think there's anyone that's going to come to Edward's rescue. So that was fun. All right. So you've told us a little bit about your least favorite characters. I would like to know about your favorite personalities and why they're your favorite. I, of course, know one of the big major ones, but I want to see if you've got any little ones hidden in left field out there somewhere.
There are so many people I love in this era, and I tend actually to have an affinity mainly with women of the era. I love all of the Queen's consort and the Queen's regnant of the time. I really don't get tribal about it, even though, as you mentioned, Anne Boleyn is my homegirl. I have a burning love for Queen Catherine of Aragon and her really magnificent daughter, Queen Mary. And I think actually we have begun to turn a corner away from having to be on teams with these queens. There's plenty of room for all of them. But I'm actually not going to name any of the Queen's regnant or consort. I'm going to mention Jane Parker, Lady Rochford. I have an acute fascination with this woman. I can't really describe how much she fascinates me. And this began at a really very young age. And I've been through all the feels with her, actually. I've seen her as this truly awful, reckless villain, to seeing her in a much more rounded light thanks to the scholarship of Julia Fox, Adrian Dillard and Charlie Fenton. But I still can't quite get at her. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're chiefly seeing her through other people's eyes, and I have so many unanswered questions, chiefly surrounding the concept of what were you thinking, Jane? And I would give good money to sit down with her over a few flagons of ale and try to get to understand her better, because I am still puzzled and I'm still fascinated. I think she is sort of an exceptional individual, but I can't quite explain why.
You're absolutely right. She is. There's this element of mystery about her, which makes her all the more intriguing. And, you know, if when people read my forthcoming book, they may notice a little bit of repetition when it comes to Jane Rochford, because I just felt that I needed to say so many times that she had nothing to do with Anne and George's downfall.
Yeah.
And I found myself saying it on several occasions, because I know how, you know, the reputation that she's received and the injustice of it, being blamed for something she didn't do for so many centuries. So I apologize if there is some repetition there. I was attempting to get a point across, and I hope that it does get across, but we'll see. We'll soon find out. But she's completely fascinating. I'd love to know more about, her relationship with George. I'd love to know more about her motivations, as you say. What in God's name was going through her mind later on when she was serving Catherine Howard? I do not know. We can only guess at it, and it's so frustrating. So, Owen, what is something that's now thought lost, and there's probably so many of these as well, that you hope will be rediscovered in the future?
So I've already mentioned Anne's letters.
Yes.
So I'm not going to repeat myself. So I'm going to answer very specifically on this occasion. which is very rare for me. I want to find a small prayer book that was once in the Hever collection. Now, you know about this book.
Yeah.
It was tragically stolen in a massive Pink Panther robbery in 1946, when nearly 1,500 items were taken from Hever. And of those precious items, this book was a real knockout. It was commissioned, we believe now, thanks to the scholarship of William Hazlitt, by Robert Dudley, fascinating character, for Queen Elizabeth I. At the time, she was going to marry the Duke of Anjou. And this little prayer book only measured 2 by 3 inches, and inside were 6 prayers written in 5 languages, the first and last in English, and the middle prayers in French, Italian, Latin, and Greek, respectively. And these, of course, are the languages spoken by Elizabeth. It was bound in black material and had gold enameled clasps, each adorned by a ruby. And inside were 2 portraits, one of Anjou and one of Elizabeth. And these were especially created by the celebrated court artist Nicholas Hilliard, and is widely believed from the few black and white images that we have of these portraits to have been his finest portrait of Elizabeth. And God, what I would give to see this book. I have thought about it so long. We have it beautifully detailed in our inventories. It sounds utterly extraordinary. It actually was believed to have been lost from about 1901. Scholarship hadn't been able to locate where it had gone after 1901. And of course, it had been purchased by Hever's then owner, William Waldorf Astor. And of course, Hever was an entirely private residence before it was stolen in 1946. So precious few people knew that it was living, this beautiful treasure of Elizabeth's, in her mother's old house at Hever. So what I would give to have it back there. Actually, it's quite extraordinary, but this Pink Panther robbery in 1946, not one of the items had ever been located. And there were many, many items stolen at the time. It was almost certainly stolen to order, and we've never heard of it since. So my goodness, if anyone knows of a tiny little book with portrait of Elizabeth and Anjou in, please get in contact, because I would love to see it.
It's an extraordinary story. And I remember we've spoken about the robbery in another episode, and an incredible coincidence that occurred with that particular book and another guest that I was interviewing. And, you know, everyone can listen to that episode. I'll link to that as well in the show notes, because that was just such a cool story. But I just think that robbery, it's like a Hollywood film, isn't it? It's the most incredible thing. Even the getaway car, everything was just Hollywood style. Like, I think, why haven't we seen a documentary or a fictional, fictionalized account? Perhaps then the word would get out, and maybe someone would realize that they've in fact inherited stolen goods, which is what I imagine has happened. I cannot imagine that would have been discarded, or, and as you say, how can none of those items have ever resurfaced? It really makes no sense, right?
Really doesn't. The mastermind behind the robbery itself, quite famous. He was known as the Pink Panther. So make a cracking film.
Absolutely.
Really would.
Yeah, I think so.
The truth behind it was extraordinary, really. Yeah.
Amazing. All right. Well, everyone keep a lookout for that in, antique sales and all that sort of thing. So just to start wrapping up, Owen, because I know you've got some really exciting things on your agenda today. What do you think we can learn from the Tudors, and how might this actually benefit us today?
Such a great question, Natalie. And I think we can learn a huge amount from these fascinating people. At times when I'm flicking through the archives, I think to myself, oh, they aren't so different to us after all. And then at other times, I realise they are entirely and completely different to us. You get this sense of composure when you're studying them, and then suddenly you're jerked into a real sense of discomposure with them as well. And I chiefly work with the history of emotions. That's what my speciality is. And when you look at history through that lens, you can really get a better understanding of how we have changed. Concepts of love or fear and other emotions have entirely shifted across the centuries. It's hard always to recognize that we have all living now been through a seismic emotional revolution since the Tudor era. And feelings are now at the very heart of everyday life and politics. That revolution has completely changed the lives and expectations of ordinary people, and especially women and minorities. But it's important to recognise that before, for example, women had the kind of rights they enjoy now, they were still able to challenge the patriarchal norms, and they were still able to enact agency. And that's what I really take comfort from. Progress isn't a given. We aren't guaranteed to always enjoy the freedoms that were won for us by our ancestors. And, we're living now in a time where we can actively see women's rights being stripped away from them, literally as we speak. It's genuinely horrific. But there are ways to circumvent draconian oppression. And looking back to the Tudor era and finding those women who refuse to bend and refuse to comply gives me hope. And I'm often asked, actually, if I'd like to visit the Tudor era. And I don't know if I would. I might visit as a fly on the wall, but probably I'd stay well clear of living in that age. We enjoy so much now. They had very little healthcare. It certainly wasn't free at the point of use, as we enjoy here in England. I think, oddly, as bleak as and as wonderful as some aspects of the Tudor era are, I do take a little bit of hope that people got by. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That they carved out their own paths, even if they weren't able to fulfill their lives as they might have wished to. So yes, that's my thing. I think that we can learn from the Tudors right now.
Yeah, I think that's quite beautiful. And I love that sort of, I don't know if love's the right word. I'm quite fascinated, intrigued, I guess, by that tension between how fragile humans are, that fragility, but also that incredible resilience and courage that people showed throughout the ages. And, we can think of our ancestors who obviously endured a lot. And I think we can take heart from it now. And it's quite like, I need that. I need to draw from that now, especially in the world that we're living that's kind of gone completely bonkers. I think that helps, doesn't it?
It does. It does help. And, it's not a lifestyle to aspire to.
No.
Don't get me wrong. But I think we can draw hope. And without hope, I don't think we're much. Look for hope if you can.
Yeah, look for hope and look for the helpers is what I always say, because they're always out there.
Absolutely.
The people doing good. Owen,
yes.
This has just been so fantastic as always. And I just want to really thank you from the bottom of my heart for returning to the podcast so many times and so generously sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your expertise. You are such an amazing, amazing, amazing person, a historian as well, but person. And I like I tell you all the time, I adore you. And thank you so much for celebrating 4 years. I can't believe it. 4 years of Talking Tudors today with me. It means a lot to me.
Oh, thank you so much. You're one of my heroes, and it's an utter honor to be on your podcast again. And thank you for all you do. Thank you for hosting this extraordinary podcast, which so many people love and enjoy. And I can't wait to enjoy our future projects together. You are a remarkable talent. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And while I still have you here, I also just want to thank all the listeners from all over the world, all different countries, all different walks of life. Thank you for tuning in to Talking Tudors. Obviously, without listeners, there's not much I can do with the podcast. So this has just blown my mind how popular the podcast has become and how beloved it is to so many people. I thank all the other guests that have come on and also shared their time with me. I think it's so much more fun when I get to talk to other people about what I love. And I do feel that I was put on this planet to do this. This isn't a kind of side hustle. This is my destiny, as dramatic as that might sound. I do feel that is the case. So thank you to everyone who listens. Thank you. A huge, huge thank you to all the patrons who support the podcast so generously. This is why it's still here. This is why it's free. This is why it's gone from a fortnightly podcast to basically a weekly or even more regular than that podcast. And I keep it up because I get motivated by their encouragement and their support. So if you do want to join the Talking Tudors patron family, You'll find all the details on my website and social media accounts. But thank you, everyone. And I cannot wait for the next, episode, next installment of Talking Tudors. And thank you again, Owen. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.